You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. With testimonies from the victims, we interviewed over a dozen people he tricked, threatened, or violated. You think that's harsh? No, he destroyed other people's lives for decades. I'm just making sure he spends a few extra years in prison for it. I'm not afraid of his people, not afraid of his threats. I know he's still in there fantasizing about a comeback, but the truth is, he's never coming. I have released Diddy's documentary on Netflix, and I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers. After watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
For a long time, people believed the most powerful currency in this industry was money, then influence, then legacy, then fear. But the real power was quieter than all of it. Silence, not the suspicious kind, the comfortable kind. The kind that feels like moving on. The kind that lets a story fade without ever being finished. And that's why this moment matters. Because when 50 Cent talks about his documentary and says what we saw was only a fraction, that doesn't automatically mean secret folders or movie-style gotcha footage. It means something more dangerous to powerful circles. It means the pieces that were kept apart are being placed side by side. And once you start watching the story as a pattern instead of a headline, everything feels different. Here's the part most people miss. A documentary doesn't just reveal information. It reveals what the system is willing to let the public look at. 4 episodes can feel like a full story, until you realize the most important details are usually the ones that don't make it into the final cut. Not because they're too wild, because they're too connected. A single clip can be dismissed. A single quote can be spun. A single rumor can be laughed off. But a chain of moments spread across years doesn't behave like a rumor anymore. It behaves like a structure. And that's what makes this documentary conversation uncomfortable. It doesn't rely on one explosive claim. It pressures you with something slower. Memory. It forces you to remember the moments people told you weren't worth remembering. The interviews that ended right when they got interesting. The jokes that landed a little too easily. The awkward pauses that got edited into nothing. The way certain questions were always answered without being answered. And when you line those moments up, you don't get a clean conclusion. You get an unfinished story that stayed unfinished on purpose. Because silence doesn't mean nothing happened. Silence means nobody was required to explain. And that only happens when power feels protected. Now listen carefully, because this is where people get it twisted. This isn't me saying, here's what they did. This is me asking, why were certain things never fully explained, even when they could have been? Why did conversations stop short? Why did timelines never get walked through all the way? Why did the industry treat discomfort like background noise? That's the core of what makes this bigger than Diddy alone, bigger than Jay-Z alone, bigger than 50 Cent alone. It's the machine that decides what gets clarified and what gets buried under time. Because denial creates a fight. Silence creates distance. And distance has always been the safest place to hide an unfinished story. Right here, before we go deeper, make sure you like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way you never miss any update. Now let's keep going. Because what 50 Cent is hinting at isn't just more footage. It's more pressure. Pressure on the parts of the story that were never meant to touch. The reason that matters is simple. Power doesn't panic when it's questioned. Real power waits. It lets time do the work. It counts on attention moving on. And for years, attention did exactly that. A moment happened. People talked. Then the conversation drifted. And eventually it became old news. That's how the most powerful stories stay alive without ever being proven or disproven, by never being finished. But that strategy has a weakness. It only works when people forget. And people don't forget the same way anymore. Clips don't disappear. Old interviews don't vanish. Screenshots don't fade. Everything stays searchable, rewatchable, and reconnected. So when a documentary comes along and even suggests we left things out, it quietly invites the audience to do something the industry hates: to go back, to rewatch, to compare, to connect. And once enough people start connecting dots, the story stops being about what's true and starts being about something more revealing. Who had the comfort of never having to explain? Because if everything was innocent and clean and fully understood, why did silence keep showing up at the exact same pressure points? Why did clarity always get postponed? Why did the story always end in the same place, right before it became specific? That's where this begins. Not with a bombshell, with a pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you notice the pattern, the past stops feeling distant. It starts feeling organized. Not in a movie villain way, not in a conspiracy board way, in a consistency way. The same response showing up again and again when pressure gets close. The same pauses. The same moving on. The same silence landing exactly where clarity should have been. That's when people realize this story was never about a single event. It was about how events were handled. Because powerful systems don't survive by erasing everything. They survive by spacing things out. Years between moments. Decades between questions. Enough distance that bringing it back up feels unreasonable. That's the trick. When time passes, people are trained to feel awkward asking again. Like they missed the window. Like it's rude. Like it's already been dealt with somewhere behind closed doors. But here's the problem. Closed doors don't create public understanding. They create assumptions. And assumptions are the strongest shield power has. Because most people don't demand answers. They assume someone else already asked. That assumption is doing more work than any lawyer ever could. This is where the documentary pressure changes shape. It's not yelling, it's not accusing, it's revisiting. It's letting old moments sit together instead of letting them age separately. And when moments sit together, something strange happens. The tone changes. Things that once felt harmless start feeling incomplete. Not illegal, not shocking. Incomplete, like a sentence that never reached a period. That's why silence is so effective. Silence doesn't argue. It doesn't contradict. It just leaves space. And space forces the audience to either forget or start thinking. For a long time, forgetting was easier. Life moved fast. New stories replaced old ones. New headlines buried old questions. But attention doesn't behave like that anymore. Now it loops. People rewatch. They notice how often explanations were promised later. They notice how often later never arrived. They notice how often the same names stayed comfortable while the conversation shifted away from them. And that's when silence stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling strategic. Because silence isn't the absence of power. It's the application of it. Choosing not to explain is only possible when you believe explanation isn't required. That belief doesn't come from innocence. It comes from insulation. Insulation built by reputation, by loyalty, by access, by knowing which questions never get pushed. That's why this moment feels heavier without being louder. No new claims are needed. No shocking footage is required. The audience is doing the work on its own. They're not asking, wait, what happened? They're asking, well, why did nothing ever follow? Why did the conversation always end early? Why did timelines stay blurry? Why did silence arrive so reliably? Those questions don't demand drama. They demand coherence. And coherence is the one thing silence can't provide. Because once people stop rushing, once they stop demanding instant closure, once they become comfortable sitting with unresolved questions, silence loses its advantage. It can no longer hide behind time. It becomes part of the story, and that's when power feels the shift. Not because it's attacked, but because it's observed. Closely, patiently, relentlessly. And observation doesn't need permission. It just needs memory. That's what this part of the story is about. Not exposure, recognition. The moment people realized the silence wasn't accidental, it was the system working exactly as designed. Once recognition sets in, the story stops needing momentum. It doesn't chase the next headline, it settles. And settled stories behave differently. They don't spike, they don't fade. They stay present, quietly shaping how every new moment is interpreted. That's when power feels exposed without anyone raising their voice, because the audience isn't reacting anymore. They're tracking who speaks freely when it's safe, tracking who stays vague when clarity would close the loop, tracking how often silence shows up right before accountability would begin. This is where the balance shifts. For years, silence worked because it blended in. It looked like maturity, like restraint, like someone too important to be dragged into details. Silence carried status, but status only protects silence when people forget. They didn't. They remembered. They started placing moments side by side instead of letting them drift apart across decades. Interviews that once felt confident now feel edited by omission. Statements that sounded complete now feel carefully narrow. Not wrong, narrow. And narrow answers are the loudest kind of avoidance once you're trained to notice them. What's unsettling isn't that nothing was said. It's that nothing had to be said. That comfort doesn't come from truth. It comes from confidence that the system will hold, that loyalty will stay intact, that access will stay valuable, that time will do the cleanup. But time stopped cleaning. It started revealing. Because when you slow everything down, the gaps don't disappear. They expand. They start to look intentional. They start to look like design instead of coincidence. And design changes how silence feels. Silence stops being neutral. It becomes behavior. Behavior that repeats. Behavior that avoids resolution. Behavior that trusts distance more than explanation. This is where people stop asking for answers. They start asking better questions. Not what did they hide, but why was explanation never necessary? That question is dangerous because it doesn't require proof. It requires pattern. And patterns don't lie loudly. They whisper consistently. Once you hear that whisper, you can't unhear it. You notice how often clarity almost arrived, and then didn't. How often conversations were redirected instead of completed. How often time was used as a substitute for explanation. That substitution worked when audiences move fast. It fails when audiences linger. And lingering is the new power. Because lingering attention doesn't burn out. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't need a reveal. It just watches behavior across time and waits for alignment. Alignment between words and actions, between confidence and context, between reputation and response. When alignment doesn't show up, silence gets heavier, not explosive, heavier. Heaviness changes how everything else lands. Every appearance feels measured against what wasn't said before. Every pause feels intentional instead of thoughtful. Every refusal to engage feels like a decision instead of restraint. This is where the narrative stops belonging to any one person. It belongs to memory. And memory doesn't argue. It compares. Comparison is quiet, but it's brutal. Because comparison doesn't accuse. It simply asks why the same move appears every time. Why distance replaces detail. Why comfort replaces clarity. Why silence replaces resolution. Those replacements don't prove guilt. They prove control, control over pacing, control over attention, control over how unfinished stories are allowed to feel old enough to ignore. But ignored stories don't disappear. They wait. They wait for an audience that understands patience, that understands that pressure doesn't need volume, it needs consistency. That's why this part of the story matters. Not because something new is revealed, but because nothing new is required anymore. The structure is visible. The strategy is familiar. The silence is recognizable. And once silence is recognized as a choice, it stops being invisible. It becomes the loudest signal of all. Not because it screams, but because it confirms something people already feel. That this story didn't survive because it was resolved. It survived because it was never finished. And unfinished stories don't end on their own. They wait for attention that refuses to move on. That's where this is headed. Not toward shock, toward permanence. Because once the audience learns how to watch without rushing, silence can no longer do the work alone. It needs belief. And belief is the one thing it's starting to lose. At this stage, the story doesn't feel unfinished anymore. It feels intentionally left open. And that difference matters, because unfinished implies neglect. Intentional implies control. For years, control didn't need to be loud. It didn't need denial. It didn't even need explanation. It relied on something far more reliable: predictability. Predictability that attention would move on. Predictability that questions would soften with time. Predictability that silence would be mistaken for strength. That predictability held everything together until it didn't. Now, when people revisit old moments, they don't feel nostalgic. They feel unresolved, not because something shocking happened, but because nothing ever closed the loop. The story paused and never resumed. Pauses are powerful. They create the illusion that something was handled privately, that there was a reason things stopped being discussed, that clarity must exist somewhere else, even if the public never saw it. But somewhere else doesn't hold weight forever. Eventually, people start asking why clarity never showed up anywhere. Not in interviews and not in statements, not in timelines. Just absence, and absence, repeated often enough, stops feeling accidental. This is where silence loses its camouflage. Because silence works best when it blends into normalcy, when it feels reasonable, when it feels earned, when people say they don't owe anyone an explanation. But explanations don't disappear on their own. They're avoided. Avoidance isn't dramatic. It's subtle. It hides inside professionalism, inside restraint, inside carefully measured responses that never quite answer the question being asked. That subtlety protected everything for a long time. Now it exposes it. Because once you see avoidance, you can't stop seeing it. Every non-answer feels familiar. Every deflection feels rehearsed. Every pause feels calculated. Not malicious, but strategic. Strategy doesn't mean wrongdoing. It means preservation. Preservation of comfort. Preservation of access. Preservation of a version of the story that never needs to be completed. But preservation has a flaw. It assumes the audience stays passive. They didn't. They became patient. And patient audiences don't forget. They don't demand instant resolution. They don't need dramatic proof. They watch consistency. They track behavior. They notice when the same response appears under different pressures. That's what's happening now. The audience isn't asking louder questions. They're asking longer ones. Questions that don't expire with the news cycle. Questions that don't disappear when a new story arrives. Questions that sit quietly behind every public move. This is why the pressure feels different. It's not aggressive, it's persistent, and persistence doesn't scare systems built on silence. It exhausts them. Because silence relies on distance. Distance between moments. Distance between accountability and attention. Distance between memory and relevance. That distance collapsed. Everything exists at once now. Early statements, later reactions, long gaps in between, all visible, all searchable, all comparable. Comparison is unforgiving. Not because it accuses, but because it reveals alignment, or the lack of it. When alignment doesn't show up, people don't get angry. They get curious. Curiosity is the enemy of narrative control, because curiosity doesn't need permission. It doesn't need confirmation. It doesn't need a reveal. It only needs inconsistency. And inconsistency is easy to spot once you stop rushing. That's the shift no one planned for. Not outrage, not backlash, not exposure. Awareness. Awareness that silence wasn't neutral. Awareness that timing mattered more than truth. Awareness that unfinished stories were allowed to age instead of being addressed. Once that awareness settles in, silence can't reset the conversation anymore. It extends it. Every quiet moment adds weight instead of relief. Every refusal to engage confirms that engagement was always optional, not impossible. That realization doesn't explode. It lingers, and lingering stories don't go away. They don't need new chapters. They just need time to keep not being answered. Because eventually the question isn't what happened. It's why nothing ever needed to be explained. And once people start asking that, the silence stops protecting the story. It becomes the story. By the time a story reaches this point, something important has already shifted. People aren't waiting for answers anymore. They're watching behavior. That's a completely different kind of attention. Because when audiences stop asking what happened and start asking, how is this being handled? Silence loses its advantage. It no longer buys time. It creates record. Every pause becomes another data point. Every non-response adds to the pattern. And patterns don't argue back. This is where the illusion of control starts to crack, quietly without drama. Not because someone said the wrong thing, but because nothing was said at all. For years, silence worked because it felt reasonable. It felt like restraint. It felt like maturity. People assumed that if something mattered, it would eventually be addressed. That assumption did most of the work. Now that assumption is gone, not replaced by suspicion, replaced by memory. Memory that doesn't reset. Memory that notices how often explanations were promised later and how rarely later ever arrived. Memory that remembers how many moments were allowed to fade instead of being finished. That memory doesn't accuse. It compares. It compares how quickly some topics are addressed versus others, how comfortable certain conversations seem, and how carefully others are avoided. How often clarity shows up when the stakes are low and disappears when they rise. This is where silence starts to feel selective. Selective silence isn't calm, it's curated. And curation tells you exactly what matters to a system, not what it says, but what it chooses to protect. Protection doesn't mean guilt, it means priority. Priority placed on stability over clarity, on distance over resolution, on letting time absorb discomfort instead of confronting it. That strategy worked when attention was impatient. It struggles when attention becomes disciplined. Because disciplined attention doesn't need escalation. It doesn't need outrage. It doesn't even need confirmation. It just keeps showing up quietly, measuring consistency over time. And consistency is hard to fake. This is why the atmosphere around this story feels heavier without getting louder. There's no rush, no frenzy, no countdown to a reveal. Just a steady sense that something unresolved is being carried forward instead of put to rest. Unresolved stories don't explode. They linger. They sit behind every interview, every appearance, every carefully chosen moment of distance. They don't interrupt. They contextualize. That's the uncomfortable part, because context changes how everything is heard. A neutral statement becomes incomplete. A calm response becomes calculated. A refusal to engage becomes a signal, not an absence. And once silence becomes readable, it stops being protective. It becomes explanatory. Not as an answer, but as evidence of choice. Choice to wait. Choice to defer. Choice to trust that saying nothing is safer than saying enough. But safety is relative, because the longer nothing is said, the clearer it becomes that nothing was ever planned to be said. And that realization doesn't create outrage. It creates permanence. The story stops needing momentum. It sustains itself through repetition, not of claims, but of avoidance. That's when the audience understands something critical. This isn't about uncovering secrets. It's about recognizing structure. Structure that knows how to survive pressure by outlasting it. Structure that mistakes patience for apathy. Structure that expects silence to age questions into irrelevance. But questions didn't age. They matured. Immature questions don't disappear when ignored. They wait. They wait through silence. They wait through distance. They wait through time. And the longer they wait, the less power silence has over them. Because silence can delay answers. It can't stop understanding. And understanding, once it settles in, doesn't need anything new to keep going. It just needs the quiet to continue. At this stage, the story stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like a test. Not a test of truth, a test of response. Because when everything that can be said has already been said, what matters is what still isn't. The pauses, the distance, the careful choice to stay vague when clarity would be simple. That's when people realize something uncomfortable. Silence isn't the absence of an answer. It's the presence of a decision to let time carry the weight instead of words, to let reputation speak instead of explanation, to let the past stay fragmented instead of connected. For a long time, that worked because fragments feel harmless. One moment here, another years later. No urgency to connect them, no pressure to see the full shape. But once those fragments are placed side by side, Something changes, not emotionally, structurally. You begin to see how often conversations stop just before they become specific, how often context is acknowledged but never explored, how frequently responsibility is redirected toward time itself. That was years ago. People moved on. It's been addressed, without ever showing where or how. That repetition isn't coincidence. It's rhythm. And rhythm reveals intent better than any statement ever could. This is where power usually relies on fatigue, on the belief that people will eventually get tired of noticing, that attention will drift, that memory will soften. But memory didn't soften here, it sharpened. People didn't grow louder, they grew steadier. They stopped chasing answers and started watching consistency, watching which moments receive energy and which are starved of it, watching how silence appears only when stakes rise. That pattern tells a story all on its own. Because silence that shows up randomly feels human. Silence that shows up precisely feels managed. And managed silence doesn't calm suspicion, it organizes it. This is the point where the narrative no longer needs new information to stay alive. Every additional pause reinforces the same conclusion. That explanation was never part of the plan. Not because it couldn't be offered, because it didn't need to be. That's the privilege of systems built on influence. They don't have to explain, they just have to wait. They trust time to smooth edges, blur questions, and make curiosity feel inconvenient. But curiosity didn't fade. It evolved. It became comparison. It became pattern recognition. It became the simple question that won't go away. Why does silence keep arriving at the same moments? That question doesn't accuse. It doesn't speculate. It observes. And observation is dangerous because it doesn't burn out. It stays, quietly tracking what's said, what isn't, and how long that gap is allowed to exist. By now, silence has stopped functioning as protection. It's become the most revealing part of the story, not because it proves anything, but because it confirms something far more important, that the quiet was never accidental. It was always doing exactly what it was meant to do. By the time you reach this point, the question isn't what's being hidden anymore. It's why nothing ever needed to be explained. That realization shifts everything. Because when power feels secure, it doesn't rush to defend itself. It doesn't overcorrect. It doesn't clarify timelines or revisit uncomfortable moments. It does something far simpler. It waits. Waiting only works when the audience believes time equals closure, when years passing are mistaken for resolution, when silence is confused with maturity. That illusion held for a long time, but now people are noticing something subtle. Every time pressure increases, engagement decreases. Every time questions sharpen, responses soften. Every time clarity would close the loop, distance reappears. That isn't coincidence. That's strategy. And strategy doesn't reveal itself through action. It reveals itself through repetition. You can dismiss one quiet moment. You can excuse two. But when silence shows up again and again at the exact same pressure points, it stops feeling organic. It starts feeling engineered. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for systems built on control. Because control relies on predictability, on knowing how audiences will react, on assuming attention will move on before patterns can form. But the pattern has already formed. And once people see it, they don't need confirmation. They don't need dramatic proof. They don't need new revelations. They just keep watching. Watching who steps forward. Watching who steps back. Watching how restraint is applied selectively, not universally. That selective restraint tells you more than any interview ever could. Because restraint isn't neutral when it's directional, when it only appears around certain topics, when it always arrives right before explanations would become specific. That's when silence stops being passive. It becomes a message that says, this conversation doesn't need to be finished, it just needs to be delayed long enough. But delay has a limit. And that limit isn't outrage. It's recognition. Recognition that silence wasn't protecting truth. It was protecting structure. Structure that depends on time doing the work so people don't have to. That structure is weaker now. Not because anyone shouted louder, but because people stopped looking away. And once attention learns how to stay without demanding, silence loses its leverage. From here on, every quiet moment adds weight, not drama. Weight, because silence doesn't reset stories anymore. It confirms them. At this stage, something irreversible has already happened. The audience no longer needs answers to stay engaged. That's the moment systems fear most. Because answers can be managed, explanations can be framed, statements can be delayed, but awareness can't be rolled back. Once people understand how silence is being used, they stop reacting to individual moments and start measuring behavior over time. And time is where patterns live. This is where silence loses its disguise. What once looked like restraint now looks selective. What once felt like patience now feels calculated. What once passed as dignity now feels incomplete. And incompleteness creates tension, not loud tension, not viral outrage, sustained pressure, pressure that doesn't explode, it accumulates. Every new appearance is filtered through memory. Every new statement is weighed against what wasn't said before. Every pause is logged, even subconsciously. That's the shift. The story no longer depends on new information to move forward. It moves because silence keeps showing up, where explanation would resolve everything. And when resolution is repeatedly avoided, people stop assuming it's accidental. They start assuming it's useful, useful to delay, useful to blur, useful to let time keep carrying questions away. But time isn't carrying them away anymore. It's stacking them. This is the phase where power realizes it's being watched differently, not aggressively, not emotionally, methodically. Because methodical attention doesn't burn out. It doesn't lose interest. It doesn't need constant stimulation. It waits. And waiting used to belong to power. Now it belongs to the audience. That reversal is subtle, but it changes everything. Because silence only works when the audience is impatient, when they need resolution quickly, when they're willing to accept distance as closure. They aren't anymore. They're comfortable with unresolved tension as long as it's acknowledged. And acknowledgement is exactly what silence avoids. So every quiet moment now feels heavier than the last. Not because it proves anything, but because it confirms one thing clearly, that silence was never about peace, it was about control. And control is always most visible right before it starts slipping. By now, the silence isn't just noticeable, it's defining. Because when nothing changes for long enough, the lack of change becomes the story. People stop waiting for a turning point and start understanding that this is the strategy. No escalation, no correction, no closure, just continuity. Continuity of distance, continuity of restraint, continuity of unanswered questions existing comfortably in public space. That comfort is revealing. It tells you that silence isn't a temporary response. It's the preferred one, the safest one, the one that's been trusted over and over because it worked before. But what worked before relied on one fragile assumption, that attention would fade faster than curiosity. That assumption didn't hold. Curiosity matured into scrutiny. Scrutiny turned into quiet comparison, and comparison stripped silence of its innocence. Now every quiet moment is contextualized, not isolated, not forgiven by time, but placed alongside every other moment like it. And when those moments sit together, they don't argue. They agree. They agree that explanation was always optional. They agree that resolution was never prioritized. They agree that time was expected to finish the job. That agreement is what unsettles people. Not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it exposes confidence. Confidence that nothing needs to be said. Confidence that silence alone is enough. Confidence that the structure will hold without transparency. That kind of confidence only exists when power feels insulated. But insulation weakens once people stop reacting emotionally and start paying attention consistently. That's what changed here. The audience isn't demanding answers anymore. They're measuring absence, measuring how often silence appears instead of clarity, measuring how long unresolved questions are allowed to sit untouched. And measurement doesn't forget. This is where silence stops delaying the story and starts advancing it. Because each pause adds another data point, another confirmation that avoidance isn't accidental, it's operational. The story no longer needs a reveal, it already has one. It's the realization that silence was never a gap in the narrative. It was the narrative. And once that's understood, silence loses its power to protect. It becomes the loudest thing left. This is where the story finally settles. Not with answers, not with confessions, not with a dramatic ending, but with clarity. Clarity that the silence wasn't empty. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't neutral. It was doing work. For years, silence functioned as protection. It delayed conclusions. It softened questions. It allowed uncomfortable moments to dissolve into time instead of being examined. And for a long time, that was enough. Until it wasn't. Because once people stop expecting closure, silence loses its advantage. Once people stop waiting to be convinced, power loses its ability to guide interpretation. And once memory stops fading, every unfinished story stays alive. That's what changed. Not the facts, not the footage, not the timeline. The audience. The audience learned how to wait without forgetting, how to observe without reacting, how to hold unresolved questions without filling them in prematurely. That patience is what reshaped the story. Silence used to signal control. Now it signals avoidance. And avoidance doesn't erase pressure, it concentrates it. From here on, every pause carries meaning. Every non-response adds weight. Every moment of distance reinforces the same conclusion. That explanation was never the goal. Endurance was. But endurance only works until attention learns how to stay. That's why this story doesn't end here. It doesn't need to, because it's no longer driven by revelations. It's driven by awareness. Awareness that silence was a strategy. Awareness that time was used deliberately. Awareness that unfinished stories were allowed to linger because they were never meant to be finished publicly. And once that awareness exists, nothing has to happen next for the story to continue. It already is. Quietly, persistently, unwilling to disappear, because silence can delay outrage. It can delay headlines and it can delay reaction, but it can't undo understanding. And understanding is the one thing silence was never designed to survive.